From CPRE and the CPRE Knowledge Hub, this is Research Minutes, a weekly look at new and important research in education. Today, we look at results from a new multi-state survey, gauging teacher perceptions and working conditions in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Prior to the pandemic, they judged their own level of success very highly. Over 96% of teachers agreed they felt successful teaching in person in the classroom. That dropped by 23 percentage points to 73% of teachers reporting that they feel successful.
We welcome Brown University's Matthew Kraft and CUNY's Nicole Simon. Kraft and Simon discuss what they learned from the survey and some important implications for states, districts, schools, and education leaders across the country.
In schools where teachers reported that they were benefiting from strong working conditions, we also found that teachers' sense of self-efficacy was higher. And we believe that this finding is a sign that school organizational practices matter now more than ever before.
That's right now on Research Minutes. Hello and welcome to Research Minutes. I'm Keith Heumiller, Managing Editor of the CPRE Knowledge Hub. And today we're very happy to be speaking with Matthew Kraft, Associate Professor of Education and Economics at Brown University and Research Director for both Future Ed and Upbeat. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Keith.
And we're also speaking with Nicole Simon, a University Director at the City University of New York and a research affiliate with Harvard University's Project on the Next Generation of Teachers. Thanks so much for joining us, Nicole.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're discussing your new report, which was produced in conjunction with Upbeat, titled Teachers' Experiences Working from Home During the COVID-19 Pandemic. The report is the result of a comprehensive survey conducted across 9 states in April and May, and it offers a unique glimpse into the world of teaching during what arguably is one of the most chaotic and challenging periods in living memory. To start, could you just tell us a little bit about the survey? What led you to conduct it, and what kinds of questions did you have about teaching during the pandemic?
So, in my role as the Director of Research at Upbeat, a education technology company that focuses on supporting districts to improve their working conditions in an effort to increase teacher retention, we knew that we were facing this unprecedented situation where the working conditions that teachers were experiencing were unlike any that we had experienced before. And our typical working conditions survey wasn't going to really capture what was going on during this rapid pivot to remote teaching during a pandemic. And so we convened a number of district leaders and school leaders and teachers to hear from them what they were experiencing, what they wanted to know about from the perspective of their teachers, what was happening on the ground to help inform their practices both in real time this spring and to think about how to prepare for the potential continuation of online or hybrid type instruction as schools begin to reopen. And so hearing their feedback helped us to think about the types of things that we wanted to know about. And teachers and school leaders and district leaders focused on thinking about what were teachers' experiences like working from home and juggling their responsibilities at home and their new role as delivering instruction online. What was it like for teachers experiencing this type of new teaching via technology? How did the teachers perceive the quality of communication they received and the opportunity to continue to collaborate? And what was their own perceptions of their self-efficacy and the degree to which students were able to access and engage regularly? And so that shaped the questions we designed. We piloted those, got some feedback, and then included them in the spring administration of this working conditions survey across a large and diverse sample of districts and charter management organizations in states in the southern, Midwestern, and eastern part of the country. And this is a really nice kind of data point because it not only complements some of the more nationally representative but smaller surveys, but it helps us to kind of dig more deeply into what are some interesting nuances and differences in the way teachers have experienced this based on things like their level of experience in a school or the type of school that they work in.
So to start, how did teachers respond personally to this dramatic shift that we saw to remote learning? Did they report struggles with things like work-life balance, added stress, or adapting to new technology?
As Matt has talked about in other places, the challenge and scale of what teachers and the system of education was asked to do, a system that employs almost 4 million people on really short notice with very limited infrastructure. The public education system in this country very famously has trouble pivoting. Was a huge undertaking and really a Herculean task. We asked teachers to learn a whole new set of technology overnight. We asked students to shift everything that they know about being a student and about knowing how to learn and how to interact in the classroom. And we asked them to do those things overnight with very little support, and in some places more than others, with a very real imminent threat of a deathly virus. And that was extremely difficult for everybody involved. And so I really think that that teachers did remarkably well, and I think that we should talk about that a lot. But I think we found in this research that teachers absolutely reported struggling. One thing that I think was interesting is that we found that mid-career teachers reported struggling more even than their peers, which is unusual because mid-career teachers are often the teachers who've finally hit their stride, and those are the teachers who often have figured out what they're doing. And we think that there was a pretty strong correlation between teachers who were at that mid-career stage, like between 5 and 15 years of experience, and who had kids at home, who had their own children in school, their own really small children bopping about, needing constant attention. So yes, teachers struggled quite a lot with that. Teachers also reported that they struggled to adapt to the new technology. Not surprisingly, teachers with the most experience reported that they struggled with that the most. But I think it was a struggle for all teachers in different ways because of different factors. And we hope that the survey can help us understand a little bit more about what exactly they were struggling with.
I would just highlight that when we ask teachers to think about their own self-efficacy and their sense of success, prior to the pandemic, they judged their own level of success very highly. Over 96% of teachers agreed they felt successful teaching in person in the classroom. That dropped by 23 percentage points to 73% of teachers reporting that they feel successful. So we see this kind of real and sudden decrease in the degree to which the teachers who responded to our survey report that they are able to connect with kids in a way that makes them feel as though they're successfully helping their students to develop their academic and whole self.
A common theme that we're starting to see in analyses of remote instruction during the pandemic relates to engagement, specifically that large numbers of students have not been or were not logging in or engaging meaningfully with their teachers. Matt, did the respondents in your survey share that impression?
Yes, teachers expressed a real concern about the degree to which the students they work with were able to regularly engage in learning. By our estimates, based on teachers' reports, approximately 60% of the students that teachers were working with were able to regularly engage in remote learning activities. This is very concerning, to say the least. And not only is it concerning on its overall level of engagement, but we see consistent patterns of teachers in schools that serve a majority of Black students, or teachers in schools that serve predominantly students from low-income families, reporting that their students are substantially less likely to be able to regularly engage in online learning compared to teachers working in more affluent schools and schools serving much smaller populations of Black students. And this is consistent with data that a number of other surveys and both from the teacher and parent perspective, as well as online learning in engagement data, have pointed to as the pandemic and the inequities in access and learning supports that cut across race and class are likely to only have been exacerbated during this sudden and rapid shift to online learning and all the different economic, health, and social challenges the pandemic brought with it.
So, Matt, you partially answered my question a little already, but I did want to ask about schools that were serving larger populations of low-income and Black students, which, as you mentioned, were more likely to report a lack of engagement. And in your report, you noticed that they were also less likely to say that students had access to vital technology. Could you walk us through those findings? And are there any factors aside from just school funding that might have contributed to those kinds of disparities?
So, in addition to asking teachers about the degree to which their students were able to regularly engage in remote learning, we also asked them about their perceptions that their students had the technology needed for virtual and online instruction. And we found that teachers reported that only about 3 in 4 students had the necessary technology as they experienced the transition to online learning, but that this differed meaningfully again along the same student characteristics that we've talked about before, that schools that were serving larger populations of Black students and low-income students, those teachers were much more likely to report that their students faced a lack of access to the vital, both online, high-speed internet and the technological devices and tools necessary to engage in learning.
You know, we talk a lot about access to technology and engagement as if access to technology is the only factor in engagement. And the really strong correlation between being poor and not being engaged in online school, I think, is far deeper than just not having a computer or Wi-Fi, although certainly those things are pretty key to being able to plug into school. But we know a lot about what it's like to grow up in poverty and what that means for students, and the multiple stressors that young people who are living in poverty are contending with on a daily basis. And really excellent schools often are a place where students go and they can shut out the noise of, the static of growing up in poverty and focus. And we took that away from students. We took that away from their families. And at the same time that, again, a global pandemic was hitting, the virus was really real in communities of color and in communities where there was limited resources, limited funds, limited ability to work from home. The level of stress in those communities skyrocketed as lots of people lost work. People had to make decisions about, parents of students had to make decisions about whether to continue going to work and risk getting sick or to stay home and lose income. I live in New York City, where people live in really tight quarters, and even the wealthiest people in New York left because just the physical space that people live in here is really hard to be quarantined in. And so I have often thought about what it would be like to be living in an unsafe home, or a home that where I didn't have any space in the apartment that I could go into to be by myself. A lot of parks were shut down. Walking down the street became pretty difficult in certain places, especially if people weren't wearing masks or being careful. And so I think that it's important that we talk also about what it's meant to be really poor and to be growing up poor at this time. And that goes beyond just this like technical fix of getting students computers. And then there's the process of getting devices out to students. And these technical problems in organizations that are not set up to operate smoothly can become really serious adaptive leadership problems. So ordering computers, breaking through the bureaucratic red tape on how you even do something like that, and making sure that the vendor gets paid and that the vendor has been approved. Those are really significant issues in districts, and those kinds of issues disproportionately affect the kinds of schools that kids who are growing up in poverty attend.
So you note in this report that most teachers in your survey reported that their district, school leadership, and peers communicated effectively and provided support. But you also note that their sense of success had dropped substantially since the shift to remote instruction. Could you expand on that a little?
Sure. Matt talked through some of the actual numbers of teachers' precipitous drop in sense of self-efficacy in teaching from before the pandemic to during the pandemic. I want to talk a little bit about the role of working conditions. So we know from a significant body of prior research, both conducted by that Matt and I have both contributed to, and so many others over the course of research history, that there are three things that really matter with regard to working conditions for teachers. Those three things are strong leadership, so having a principal at the helm of a school, having existing within a district that is thinking strategically and communicating about what those ideas are. Second, having effective relationships with colleagues, so opportunities to work alongside other people who can help you workshop ideas, help take some of the burden off of the work, help you make sense of some of the challenges that you have, and working inside of schools that really think carefully about school culture. What does it mean to be a student in those schools? What does it mean to be a parent of a student in those schools? And those things matter tremendously for teachers. In schools where teachers reported that they were benefiting from strong working conditions, we also found that teachers' sense of self-efficacy was higher. And we believe that this finding is a sign that school organizational practices matter now more than ever before. Teachers in every single career phase and life stage talked about struggling with the shift to remote teaching. And obviously, as we've discussed, not always in the same ways, but the role of supportive working conditions was huge for teachers.
So the working conditions that we asked teachers about focused on things like the communication they received from the district and their administrators, the degree to which they felt recognized in their work and their efforts, the opportunities they had for collaborating with their colleagues, and the degree to which kind of expectations seemed fair to them. And somewhat surprisingly, the teachers who responded to our survey, which had a very high response rate, over 78% of teachers responded, were relatively positive about those working conditions. But to be clear, that overall kind of degree of feeling positive and thankful for the support that their schools provided them doesn't mean that the support was sufficient for them to fully successfully transition in this new environment of remote instruction. And we see that as evidenced by the drop in teacher sense of success that we talked about earlier. We also find that when we move beyond these kind of simple descriptives of what % of teachers agree they felt supported on a different number of items, that was meaningful and wide variation across the schools in our sample in the degree to which teachers perceived that their schools were able to support them specifically during this transition. And as we'll talk about, that mattered.
So that brings me to my last question. We're speaking now in early July, and we're rapidly approaching the doorstep of the 2020-2021 school year. Few know at this point exactly what school will look like when fall rolls around, but are there any lessons that could be learned from your work here? What do you think districts, school leaders, teachers, or even families can take away from this report in their attempts to improve learning and instruction in the months ahead?
Right now, districts and school leaders are faced with one of the most challenging decisions and situations that our education system has encountered in generations, and that is how to design schooling with the uncertainty and risks of doing so during a pandemic. That is coupled with the fact that most districts are facing huge budget deficits and without substantial federal aid are grappling with having to make real cuts when at the same time they're asked to support new expenditures related to keeping kids and teachers safe if they're attempting to return to in-school and in-person instruction. I think our survey has a lot of insights that school leaders can draw upon in thinking about how they're facing difficult trade-offs and decisions in the fall. Obviously, every place needs to decide if and when and how they can approach schooling in a safe way. But regardless of whether school is in person or online or some hybrid of those two, we know that working conditions matter tremendously, and that working conditions, as Nicole highlighted, are not narrowly those things that we might think about, like the quality of the school building and infrastructure or the resources in the science lab. That it's about relationships in school organizational practices and systems. And we see clearly in our data that those schools that had more successful working conditions were able to support their teachers to pivot and maintain a relatively high sense of success compared to those teachers who previously had a high sense of success, but whose own self-efficacy dropped tremendously in contexts where their working conditions were far less supportive.
When I think about lessons that we've learned from this survey and in general from this time period, I have two maxims that come to mind from mentors of mine. One is something that Andres Alonso, who used to be the CEO of the Baltimore City Schools, talks about a lot, which is the importance of leading from a place of hope. I think that at this time of extreme unrest and despair and sadness, at a time where we are seeing emotions rise in all different facets of our public and private lives, that really sticks with me as something that leaders should remember, that it is so important to hear from people in charge that they know what they're doing, even when they don't, and that they have hope that it can get better. And I think that that is something that we really need to start to hear from leaders at every level, certainly at the national level, but also at the city, state, and school level, that there's hope for a better future, and that we can do this, and we can do it together. But then the second piece of that comes from one of my first bosses, whose name was Elika Cole, and he used to say all the time, real is real. I think real talk helps a lot in a situation like this, being really straight about what you know, when you know what you're doing and when you don't know what you're doing. And I think that for leaders to communicate about their what they're concerned about, what they do and don't know, while leading from a place of hope is really key. And I think will be key to any efforts, and certainly to getting people to follow a lead. And then I think that we as a field need to learn from the world of design thinking. We need to ideate. We need to stay in that space for a little bit. We need to totally figure out new ways of doing our work. We need to redefine roles. We need to ask students and their parents to give input, to think about that with us. And of course, as Matt and I have tried to begin doing in this survey, we need to ask teachers, what do they think? What do they need? What are their experiences? What are their struggles? And I think that we can do this. We can figure out ways to make the coming school year less of a disaster than this one was, in part because we can start now. We can start with a plan in July and get to work on figuring it out. But if we do that without really thinking outside the box about how we might approach the work, and if we do that without involving all players in the work, I don't think that we can be successful.
Well, this is fantastic work, and we encourage our listeners to go and read the full report. Again, it's titled Teachers' Experiences Working from Home During the COVID-19 Pandemic, and it's available at www.shankerinstitute.org. Matthew Kraft and Nicole Simon, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Research Minutes, presented by the CPRE Knowledge Hub. For more episodes or to subscribe to the podcast, you can find us at researchminutes.org. To share thoughts on today's episode or to suggest future topics, follow us on Twitter at CPRE Hub. That's CPRE Hub.